You know what nobody really talks about? The grief you carry for someone who's still alive. And I don't mean like they're sick or they have dementia, although that's its own kind of pain. I mean grieving for the parent who is right there, sitting across from you at Thanksgiving dinner, but who was never emotionally capable of giving you what you actually needed as a child.
Yeah, that hits different because how do you even explain that to someone? Like, hey, I'm grieving my mom. Oh my God, did she pass? No, she's fine. She never really saw me.
Right. And that's exactly why it's so isolating. Because there's no funeral, there's no casket, there's no moment where the world stops and says, we acknowledge your loss. You're just carrying it, quietly, sometimes for decades.
And I think for a lot of people, especially men, honestly, you don't even recognize it as grief. You just think you're angry, or you think you're just not a family person. You build this whole identity around being independent, being tough, not needing anyone. And underneath all of that is just a kid who stopped asking.
A kid who stopped asking. That's exactly it. Because at some point, and this is the part that just breaks my heart, at some point, every child who grows up with an emotionally unavailable parent makes a decision. And it's not a conscious decision, it's survival. They decide, I will stop needing things from this person because needing them hurts too much.
And then you grow up and you wonder why you can't let anyone in. Why intimacy feels like a threat. Why you flinch when someone is genuinely kind to you.
Because your nervous system learned very early that love is unreliable, that closeness is where you get hurt. And so you built walls. Not because you're broken, but because you were smart. You were a brilliant little kid who figured out how to survive an environment that wasn't safe.
But here's where I push back a little. Not in a cold way, but at what point do we stop blaming the parent? Because some of these parents, they were dealing with their own trauma, their own unprocessed grief, poverty, mental illness, addiction. Some of them genuinely did not have the tools.
And that's the most painful part of this whole thing. You're absolutely right. Most emotionally unavailable parents aren't villains. They're not monsters. They're wounded people who never healed. And you can hold that truth. You can have real compassion for their story and still grieve what you didn't get. Those two things can live in the same room.
That's hard though, because it feels like if you admit you're hurting, you're somehow betraying them. Especially in certain cultures where you just don't talk about your parents that way. You don't say, my mother failed me, even if she did, even if it's the truth.
And that's the trap. That is the invisible cage. Because the loyalty you feel toward the parent who hurt you is often the very thing that keeps you from healing. You're so busy protecting their story that you never get to tell yours.
So what does this grief actually look like in everyday life? Because I don't think people always connect the dots.
It looks like crying at a movie where a father hugs his daughter and you don't even know why it hits so hard. It looks like scrolling past Mother's Day posts and feeling this hollow ache you can't name. It looks like being 35 years old and still rehearsing conversations in your head, things you wish you could say, things you wish they'd say back. It's living with a phantom limb. Something was supposed to be there, and your whole body knows it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people just heard themselves in that.
And I want to say something to those people right now. If you're listening and you feel this, if you've been carrying this quiet, unnamed grief, I need you to hear me. You are allowed to grieve someone who is still alive. You are allowed to mourn the parent you needed and never had. That is not betrayal. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of you finally being honest about your own story.
And it doesn't mean you have to cut them off. It doesn't mean you have to have some big dramatic confrontation. Sometimes healing is just finally admitting to yourself in a quiet room, I deserved more, and it wasn't my fault that I didn't get it.
It wasn't your fault. Say that again for the people in the back.
It was not your fault.
You know, there's this concept in psychology called ambiguous loss. It was developed by Dr. Pauline, and it describes exactly this, the grief of losing someone who is still physically present. And she says it's one of the most difficult kinds of grief to process because there's no closure, there's no clear ending. You're just living in the middle of it.
And I think that's why so many people stay stuck, because you keep hoping. Part of you is still that little kid standing at the window waiting for them to show up differently.
And maybe they won't. Maybe they can't. And the work, the real, hard, sacred work, is learning to become the person who finally shows up for you, to reparent yourself, to give that little kid inside of you the words they never heard.
Words like what?
Part of, I see you. I'm proud of you. You are enough. And you always were.
Yeah. I think we should just sit with that for a second.
Yeah, let's do that. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and be gentle with yourself today. We'll see you next time.